Chapter 9. I noticed that there were a few smaller wooden houses behind the main one, and they were also hollowed out. There was splintered wood littered around the forest floor, and I could tell that there had been something of a fight for the vampires to secure this place. But even though it was empty, there was something eerie about the atmosphere of the place. I knew that vampire lairs tended to carry a weird energy with them because they rested somewhere between the worlds of the living and of the dead. "Come on, boy," I urged and nudged the direwolf. Casanova padded forward toward the abandoned smokehouse. He wasn't hesitant, but he was definitely on the alert, like he'd smelled something wasn't right. And I had to agree with him. Everything about the place seemed a little off. Even for a vampire lair. The place felt dead, which wasn't unusual for a nest of bloodsuckers, but there was definitely something moving just beyond my peripheral vision, something that was a lot bigger than the usual creatures of the forest. The fur on my back bristled, and I instinctively reached for my moon sword. Loosened my grip on Casanova's reins as I did so, and he slowed down, obediently as I slid off. The stench from the smokehouse was starting to overpower everything else in the area, and though it wasn't as bad as the usual vampire dwellings, it still smelled slightly rotten and like something I couldn't quite describe other than latrine. I remembered that Arthur had said there was still meat in there from when it had been abandoned, and I took a deep breath and tried to hold my nose so that I wasn't too distracted by it. The main door to the place was coming off its hinges, like someone inside had tried to knock the door down in order to escape. I wasn't sure if Arthur and his companion had done that, or if the original owners had smashed through the door during the initial attack. Whoever had done it had definitely been fleeing something, and it made my heart quicken as I stopped to listen for any noise from inside. I took a deep breath and reached for the door. I saw my gauntlet glimmer in the afternoon light, and I was reminded of all those action movies where the shooter's position is given away by a flash of light on metal. 1, I said as I looked at Casanova. 2. But on the count of 3, the door swung completely open on its own volition. Or so I thought. Before me stood 2 healthy and mean-looking vampires. The one on the left was wearing a red tunic that looked similar to the ones that some of the knights wore in the castle. The one on the right was also wearing a red tunic, and he smiled with glowing yellow rotten fangs at me. It was odd that they were wearing something that a shifter would wear, but it wasn't my main focus. My eyes were more drawn to their pale, waxy foreheads, which looked like they'd been branded as if they were some kind of cattle. I couldn't quite make out the mark, but I assumed that it must have something to do with whoever they answered to in this coven. Whoever Arthur had killed. "Oh no," the vampire on the left hissed. "Looks like they've sent another to avenge their poor little friend. Well, isn't that a treat? I was just getting hungry for lunch." "Fuck you blood-sucking parasites," I heard myself yell, and then all hell broke loose. I brandished my sword as both vampires came straight for my neck. However, the vampire on the right suddenly tripped over, and I realized that Casanova had him by the foot. The direwolf pulled him out into the woods and started to claw at his face, while I took on the first guy. He grabbed my left arm and tried to pull it backwards with his vampire strength, but I swiveled around and sliced his side with my moon sword. Couldn't get a good angle, but it was enough for him to loosen his grip and hiss at me. "You fool," he screeched. "You have no hope against the master." The master? That's who Wenderoth had been writing to in the letters, and now it appeared that I had found his personal lair, or at least his coven. "Oh, fuck off," I instructed him as he clamped his teeth down on my gauntlet. I felt a sting rush through my arm up to my shoulders, and I knew that this would take some time to heal. He'd gotten my dominant hand, but I decided to do something that I'd never ever done before. I grabbed my sword from my right hand with my left hand, and before the vampire knew what had hit him, I brought the blade straight down into where his heart should have been, and then pulled the sword out again. He coughed a few times, and I noticed that the moon sword was covered in a kind of gray sticky goo rather than any blood, which was actually kind of more gross. But I wanted to polish this guy off so that I could help Casanova with the other one. So I brought the sword around in an arc that ended at the vampire's neck. Despite the fact that I was using my left hand, I still managed to lop his head clean off. I saw the eyes glaze over, and then the tongue flopped out of his mouth before the rest of the body even collapsed. With one vampire dealt with, I ran over to the clearing where Casanova had pinned down the other vampire. Even though the pup had done a pretty good job of mauling the vampire, The only way to be sure the creature was dead was to strike him with the moon sword. Good boy, Casanova, I said as I lifted the blade. You oaf, the vampire managed to gasp through his mangled face. The master will cast a shadow over all of your supposed powers. Prepare for your last fight, because you and the rest of your kind will not survive the rise of the vampires. You won't be there to see it, I said and then whistled to Casanova. As soon as Casanova moved his big black paw off the vampire's neck, I sliced off the second vampire's head as well. I saw the same gray-black ooze stain the ground and the corpse twitched for a few seconds before it went still. For a moment, the direwolf and I stood still as we searched the area for any more signs of vampires. It was tricky with the smells since the vampires kept their places so nasty, but neither of us could smell or see anything or anyone else. That was great, Casanova, I said once we were satisfied there weren't any more of the creatures in the area. We're really quite the team, aren't we? Casanova huffed in agreement and then nuzzled my hand. He wagged his tail as I scratched behind his ear, and then he put his nose to the ground and started to sniff around casually like he did back at the estate. Fuck, I murmured as I waved around my right arm. The stinging had subsided somewhat, but if the moon goddess had been at her full strength, the wound probably would have healed already. It was annoying to feel like a mere human while in hybrid form, but until we knew more about the lunar eclipse, I was going to have to put up with the slow healing injuries. Let's see what they were protecting inside, I murmured and then looked at Casanova. Maybe you should stay out here on guard duty. Let me know if any more vampires show up. The dog patted the ground to let me know that he understood, and then he sat down in the clearing. But his ears swiveled like radar dishes and his eyes watched every movement in the forest. No one would be able to sneak past him. So I took one more deep breath and then ventured inside the smokehouse. As usual, the first thing that hit me about the place was the smell, which was pretty rank. I caught whiffs of old meat and burnt wood too, which kind of reminded me of the castle. But just like every vampire nest I'd been in, it was full of old rotting materials and cobwebs in the corner. I didn't know how anyone could live like this, but then I remembered that they weren't exactly living. I shook my head and started to move forward, but then I felt another twinge of pain up my arm. It was a reminder that if we were going into battle with limited healing capabilities, then we would have to shift our strategies. We couldn't count on our quick healing to carry us through the fight, and the odds of us losing a lot of werewolves during the upcoming battle was a new and horrible reality. All right, you bastards, I muttered. Let's see what the hell you've been up to. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I took a few more steps inside. Wasn't surprised by the rotting meat that still hung from some of the hooks, but the burgundy flags that hung from the walls were a new twist. I knew that the vampires often hung flags, banners, and other items that they stole, sort of like how kids in high school used to hang stolen street signs on their bedroom walls. But the displays I'd seen before were just a random mix of whatever the vampires had uncovered during their attacks, which meant it was usually a mishmash of colors and materials. Yet every flag in the place was the same dark red material and featured the same design of a gold shield inscribed with a sun surrounded by 4 diamonds. Now I was stumped, because if I didn't know any better I'd say that the vampires were worshipping heraldry, and the strangeness didn't end there. It was full of burgundy candles and there was red and blue blood on the walls smeared to create the same pattern as the shield on the flags. Something seemed deeply amiss, and the hairs on the back of my neck were at full attention again. It didn't look like anything I'd seen in the journal before, and if I was honest, it looked more like something I'd seen in the castle than a nest. What is going on in here? I whispered as I circled the room. The place was full of velvet chairs, tables set with silverware and goddess help me even napkins. There were even a few basic art pieces like a necklace of wooden beads that hung from one wall. The necklace featured a wooden shield with the same heraldry, so I plucked it from the hook it was hanging on and put it in my sack. When I peered up into the rafters, I saw row after row of hanging fish and ham hocks. They looked like they'd been petrified in time for years, so much so that they were practically made of some different material by now. The place was full of old empty glass bottles as well, but I couldn't seem to find anything that would be of use, other than the heraldry. Didn't seem like there was much loot or really anything that wasn't the heraldry or some kind of shrine to it. I heard the door behind me slam open and my heart leaped. I spun around with my blade in my hand, but I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw it was Casanova. Aren't you supposed to be on watch? I asked with a laugh. The direwolf looked back outside and then flopped down in the doorway. I'm almost done, I replied as I turned my attention back to the room. I turned over a few of the chairs and peered at the floorboards, but I couldn't find any secret hiding places for more treasure. I didn't get the sense that there was anything else in the place of any use, since it seemed to be an altar to the heraldry, and unlike a lot of churches I'd been in, the vampires didn't seem to be big on golden chalices or statues of their god. But the thing was, vampires didn't have shields or gods. Only the blue bloods traced their heraldry and worshipped the moon goddess, so where had all this come from? I grabbed a few items that could fit in my pack that had their wicked heraldry on it, and hoped it would be sufficient for the king's learned men to analyze. Come on, I said to the direwolf, and I stepped outside and back into the fresh air. There was nothing I loved more than stepping back outside after spending time in the mangy lair of a vampire. I mean, of course there were quite a few things in life that I enjoyed more than that, but I certainly didn't feel that way right now. Casanova started to pad away from the old smokehouse as soon as I nudged him, as if the pup was just as anxious to escape the place. At least we'd gotten vengeance for the fallen knight, but the feeling of something strange in the area still followed us. As Casanova bounded over the soil and moss of the forest of Thoth, I tried to remember if I'd ever seen a similar herald at court, but I was a newcomer to Lupercalia, and I hadn't really spent that much time with the blue bloods. I'd earned my estate fairly quickly, so when I wasn't on a quest I was either at my manor or back in New Jersey. I'll bet Tabitha will recognize it, I said aloud. If it's a real blue blood sigil, that is. Casanova barked in agreement and then started to run faster. He must have sensed my urgency, or maybe he just wanted to put as much distance between us and the old smokehouse as well. Either way, we were making good time back to the castle. I felt another twinge under my right gauntlet, though it was starting to itch, so at least it was healing. But I'd never experienced such a slow healing process since I joined the ranks of Lupercalian knights, and I was once again reminded that the whole army was in serious trouble. At last, I could begin to smell the dewy fields of Lupercalia in the distance, and I felt a sense of relief that we'd made it back in time. But once we were out of the forest, I could see that the sky was still gray and dark clouds scud across the sky as a warning that there was more bad weather ahead. Come on, Casanova, I said, and I grasped the reins tighter. Let's get back before the rain starts again. I could begin to see smoke rising out of the chimneys in the small village of Stock, and just beyond that was the palace. It was a sight that should have made me happy, but as I stared at the high, grim walls, all I felt was a touch of Chapter 10. As we neared the castle, I could see the knights that had gathered near the drawbridge. I had no idea how many knights there were in the kingdom, but there was a mob of them on the green near the moat. Casanova started to slow down as we approached the other knights and their direwolves, and most of the warriors turned to watch us go by. A group of about 20 knights were camped out at the foot of the drawbridge, and though they greeted me with nods, they didn't move out of the way either. Sir Henry, one knight who I didn't recognize, called out. We were told to watch for your return. You're to go straight to the king's quarters to tell him what you've learned. Of course, I said. The knights cleared a path to the drawbridge, but I could feel their eyes on me as we rode over the moat. I was sure they were dying to ask me questions about my mission, but they would hear it soon enough from the king. Casanova stopped near the olive tree in the courtyard, but instead of a squire, we were met by one of the shifters who usually guarded the drawbridge. The shifter took the reins and then nodded to me as I slid from the direwolf's back. Sir Henry, he said in a low voice, I will take Casanova for now. Where are the squires? I asked in surprise. They have been told to remain indoors for their own safety, he said. Only blue bloods are allowed beyond the walls. Are you injured? I didn't know how he could tell, but my wrist still actually hurt like hell. It's nothing, I replied. He raised an eyebrow and then pointed to one of the lesser-used archways. I don't think the king will mind if you stop at the doctor's on your way to the office, he said quietly. A squire will escort you from there. I need to talk to the king right away, I said. The knight looked around and then stepped closer to me. The king will need a moment to prepare for your report, he assured me. And how would you know that? I asked. This is the castle, Sir Henry, he said. There are no secrets here. I would have liked more information, but the knight didn't seem inclined to offer anything more. I finally sighed, gave Casanova a quick pat on the head, and then trotted toward the doctor's office. This part of the palace was always dark, and the torches rarely did much good. On a gray, damp day like the one we were having, it also felt like I'd wandered into an episode of Scooby-Doo. Luckily, I didn't encounter any ghosts, though I did brush against a couple of spiderwebs. I pounded on the doctor's door with my left hand and waited impatiently for someone to answer. I could hear footsteps scurrying around the room, but they finally approached the door, which swung open to reveal the court physician. "I need medical help," I said as I held up my arm. I removed my gauntlet even though it still hurt like hell to even touch the wrist. I could see that the wound had started to heal, but the skin was still red and raw. "Normally, I would say it looks terrible," the doctor said, and a flush of dread raced through my body. "But you have red blood and your flesh is supposed to be this pink color. Come now, I'm going to give you some garlic butter with peppermint. It may sting, but it will extract all trace of the venom." "I'll take whatever works," I assured him. "And if you have some extra, I might like a to-go bag for the road." "A to-go bag?" he asked as he started to gather his ingredients. "It's a New Jersey expression," I said. "If you could make some extra." "Ah, yes," he said as he started to smash the ingredients in a mortar and pestle with impressive agility. "For the upcoming battle, I have already started to prepare some poultices for the knights to carry with them. King's orders." "That's good," I sighed. He tasted his concoction, added a few more peppermint leaves and another pat of butter, and then pounded away again. After another quick taste test, he came back to me and studied the wound. "That's some bite," he said as he leaned in for a closer look. "It is," I agreed. "But the other guy looks a lot worse." "You managed to kill a vampire without using your dominant hand?" the doctor asked, clearly impressed. "I did," I said, "though I had some help from Casanova. And actually it was 2 vampires." "Quite impressive," he said. "Now, hold still for a moment." He started to apply the salve to my arm with a small brush. It hurt like hell for a second, but then I started to feel the tissue stretching and rebuilding itself. After a few moments, I could watch my wrist knit itself back together, which was a little freaky, but at least the pain faded as well. "Thank you so much, doctor," I said. "I knew that you could handle this." "The goddess is weakened," he said in a grave voice, and he met my eye. "I don't know how much longer these medicines will work. Their power is derived from the goddess." All I could do was nod. It was bad enough that the army had to fight when the goddess was so weak, but the doctor knew that he'd have a lot more to deal with in the coming days, and his own salves and bombs wouldn't be as powerful. "We'll find our way," I said as the last ligaments reattached themselves to the tendons. "We have to." "Yes, of course," he said. "Everyone will do their duty." There was a knock on the door, and it swung open before the doctor could respond. Sebastian stood there with a torch, and he cleared his throat and then looked at me. "I guess the king's ready," I said. I nodded to the doctor again, and then I followed the little squire through the winding halls to the king's private office. I was convinced that Sebastian was leading me through yet another secret squire tunnel, but the short man in front of me wouldn't answer my questions. He finally stopped in front of a door and knocked, and a moment later another squire opened the door. The 2 men seemed to hold a silent meeting, and then the second squire motioned me to follow him. We walked along a narrow hallway with hard stone floors. It was cold enough that I could feel the frosty stone through my boots, and the squire's breath looked like little smoke clouds as he huffed along. The hallway ended at a winding staircase, and the squire bounced up the steps. Our footsteps echoed against the stairwell, so it sounded like 100 men were climbing the steps. I wondered if the heraldry mark I'd seen was one the squires would recognize. They certainly seemed to know everything about the castle and its inhabitants, and if the vampires had stolen the symbol from one of the families, they'd probably be able to identify who the mark belonged to. But the king needed to be told before anyone else, so I held my tongue until we reached the top of the staircase, where I was confronted with another small squire in front of another door. "Sir Henry for the king," my guide announced. "He is expected." The new squire nodded and pulled the door open with all of his might. Groaned like it hadn't been used in decades, and a slight coating of dust drifted down from the doorframe. I sneezed just as a flash of light washed over me, and as I tried to bat away some of the dust, I could see the king was still in his hybrid form even though he was sitting at his desk. Despite the noise from the door, the king didn't look up from the manuscript he was studying, so I bounded inside and ran straight to the desk. "Sire," I panted as I came to a stop mere inches from the massive piece of furniture. The king looked up at me and shut the manuscript immediately. "Sir Henry," he said as he stood up, "I wasn't expecting you to return so soon." The king looked at the squire who was about to close the door, and the little man went pale just as he slammed the door shut. The king harumphed and brushed down the gray hairs in his wolf beard before he turned back to me. "Do you have news?" the king asked. "I do," I exhaled, and I held up my right arm. "The vampires tried their hardest to take me down, but they couldn't. Your Highness, I don't know where to begin. I've seen things that I think only you can explain." The king met my eyes, and for a moment I only saw a man. Not a royal nor a werewolf, but simply a man who was afraid for his friends and his kingdom. And then he lifted his chin and took a deep breath. He might be afraid, but he was also ready to fight. "Show me," he ordered. I pulled the chain out of my sack and set the beads on the desk. I pointed to the shield with the heraldic mark, and then waited for the king to speak. "Sir Henry," he murmured, "I don't know what you're getting at with this." I felt a cold rush run up my spine to the top of my ears. I thought that surely I'd crack something, but this just seemed like old hat to the king. This coat of arms was imprinted everywhere around the vampire hideout. I replied. "It was branded on their foreheads. There were shrines devoted to this very image, sire, and I don't recognize it." "That's impossible," he murmured, and he shook his head. This time it didn't look as if he was denying anything. Instead it looked like he was genuinely confused, and I looked around the room and tried to gather myself so that I could ask in the most respectful way what the hell was going on. "Sire," I murmured, "if it's impossible, surely it's of more interest." "But this is ludicrous," he suddenly shouted, and he slammed his paw on the desk. "The House of Gregoriat went extinct 300 years ago, at the last oblation." I was so shocked by his outburst that I went still. I heard the king growl, but then he collected himself. I waited as he brushed off his robes and ran a hand through his beard again, and then he looked up at me. "But your Highness," I said, "there is another oblation due. Don't you think the two could be connected?" "Anything is possible in these dark times," he sighed. "Tell me about this house," I said. "I don't recognize the name." "You wouldn't," he said. "As I mentioned, their line was killed off during the last recorded oblation." "How?" I asked. "The House of Gregoriat was one of the most powerful houses of the kingdom," he said as he leaned on the desk. "They were unmatched in battle, and they were also quite wealthy. The family claimed they had been one of the first families chosen by the moon goddess." "Was that true?" I asked. "Many historians believe so," the king replied. "They were certainly powerful enough to rival my own family." "So how did one event wipe them out?" I asked. "It wasn't a single event," he sighed. "It had been building for some time. Heirs died, family members passed away. By the time of the last oblation, there was only one son left. He was sent on a mission and was never heard from again. There were no more male heirs after that, and the few women who were still alive soon joined their line with other families." "Let me guess," I said. "His last quest was in the forest of Thoth." "It was," the king agreed as he picked up the wood beads. "But he wasn't a vampire. He was one of us. A blue-blooded wolf through and through. There's no reason that he would have been involved with the vampires. The only way the vampires could have this is if they killed him." "But this symbol was everywhere," I countered. "It wasn't just some random item the vampires stole off a victim." "A wolf cannot be turned," the king insisted. "It's never happened that you know of," I murmured. The king looked up and gave me a hard stare. He had every reason to berate me for challenging him, but his first concern would always be the kingdom. He looked down at the shield again and then let it fall to the desk. He understood now that there was some deeper connection between the vampires and werewolves, whether the aristocracy liked it or not. "Tell me about this place you found," the king sighed. "It looked like a temple, and this mark was on everything like it was a symbol of whoever or whatever they were worshipping," I said. "There were two vampires there, and they kept referring to the master just like Windroth did. I think that the master must be connected to this house, sire, or maybe he simply claimed it as his own. But either way, this master probably knows what happened to the last Gregoriat heir. And you think that understanding that will help us now? He asked. Yes, I said. We know that the vampires have been studying blue blood, and maybe Gregoriat was their first attempt to convert a werewolf. That's true. They've had 300 years to figure out what to do, and we have a lot of catching up to do. The king was lost in thought for a moment, but he finally nodded and then pounded on his desk 2 times. Suddenly, a squire emerged from a set of drawers on the right-hand wall. He crawled out of the bottom drawer and tried to make it look painless, though I caught a grimace as he stepped over the edge of the drawer. The little man brushed himself off and then stood at attention. Sire, he said in an unnaturally high-pitched voice, what can I provide for you? Send for the mathematician immediately, the king replied without even looking at the squire. The squire nodded before crawling back into the drawer. Somehow the drawer closed again, and there was a brief scuffling sound as I assumed the squire went off to deliver the message. Did he just come out of a drawer? I asked because I still wasn't sure that was what I'd actually seen. What? The king asked absent-mindedly. Oh, probably. The squires have entrances hidden everywhere. I shook my head and then turned back to the king. I could tell he was lost in some distant memory, and I wondered if he'd known the last Gregoriat night. Sire, I said and took a deep breath. Is there any chance that the knight who went missing could have been turned into a vampire? I mean, why else would they be worshipping the house of Gregoriat? I waited for the angry words to spill forth again, but there was nothing but silence. I heaved a sigh of relief that my suggestion hadn't gotten me tossed out of the castle for good, but it also meant that as much as the king hated the idea, he had probably already wondered the same thing himself. It's terrible to think, he said, but it's the only thing that makes sense. There's no other reason that the vampires would be worshipping a blue-blooded household. It's simply unheard of. In all of recorded history, when a vampire attempted to turn a wolf, the wolf died in the process. Suddenly there was a knock at the door behind me. Come in, the king boomed, and a small man wearing a bright blue tunic, blue suede leggings and large round glasses entered. Sire, the bespectacled man said and bowed. I was summoned to your offices. When is the next oblation? The king demanded. The man stepped back and started to count on his fingers like a kid in second grade math. He seemed to realize what he was doing, and he quickly tucked his hands behind his back. Sire, he stuttered. This is not an exact science. If I attended to my readings, all that I could say was that it's now due any day. Great. If I were back in Jersey, this wouldn't be a problem. There NASA had the phases of the moon and the solar system down to an exact science that had been in place for years. But the phases of the solar system in Lupercalia and in New Jersey weren't always aligned, and I hadn't paid enough attention to notice the differences. All I knew for sure was that sometimes there would be a full moon in Lupercalia when I left, but there would be a new moon when I arrived in New Jersey and vice versa. Great, I muttered and huffed. Do you have any better predictions, Sir Henry? The mathematician sniffed. Perhaps this is yet another great skill you have learned? That snarky response earned the mathematician a glare from the king, but the hybrid then looked at me as he was waiting for an answer. Sire, I said, and I gave the mathematician a hard side eye. Where have the troops been deployed so far? Moon Knights were already sent to the western temple of the goddess, the king replied, and others have been sent to important sites across the land. But there hasn't been a direct attack yet? I asked. No, he confirmed. There hasn't been word of any attacks yet, but the vampires always target the temples of the goddess first, so we've made sure those were protected. We have received word that a large vampire force that included other beasts was mobilizing for a battle. That's not good, I said. Did one of the scouts discover their army? Which direction were they heading? It was from the vampires themselves, the king replied. They sent a note, written in blood. Oh, that's just... I huffed and then stopped. Wait, what do you mean other beasts? Beasts that they've turned, he said. Slaves in their image, if you will. The Moon Knights are already on their way to meet this army. It was agreed that the best chance we have of destroying these abominations is to fight them before the oblation. I said and then studied the king. Sire. Yes, it is a trap, the king said. We all recognize that. Then why did you send the knights? The vampires aren't the only ones who can set a trap, he replied. You may have noticed that there were still knights gathered below. I did, I said. They were held back until you returned, he said. We agreed that the moon goddess was strong with you, and though she may be weakened at the moment, she would find a way to see you back to the palace in time to take command. Take command, I stammered. Sire, I've never. Then that's it, the king said, and he slammed his hand on the table twice. Summon the troops. The royal mathematician looked between both of us for a second and just shrugged. Sire, I only deal in numbers, and the mathematician started to protest. But the bottom drawer opened again, and another squire popped out. Your Highness, the squire squeaked. At your service. Send a fast scout to tell the troops that have already left to halt and wait for word from Sir Henry, he ordered the squire. The tiny man's eyes widened, but he nodded and crawled back into the drawer, before pulling it shut behind him and scurrying away. I gulped and tried to think of something to say. I knew that the king believed in me, but I'd never done anything like lead an entire army before. Sire, I said, I don't know if I can. Nonsense, he said as he waved his hand. You'll have the likes of Greyback and Blueclaw to assist you with strategy. Now, as you said, time is of the essence. Consult the knights and be on your way. And that's an order. Of course, sire, I said and bowed. I brushed past the mathematician and opened the door I'd entered through. Wasn't sure I could find my way back on my own, but a squire appeared out of nowhere to lead me back to the courtyard. This is crazy, I muttered as we walked down the stairs. Yes, Sir Henry, the squire replied. After that, I was silent until I was back in the gray daylight. As I stepped through the arch, I saw old Blueclaw, who was deep in conversation with several other knights. The king made it sound like at least some of the other knights were expecting me to lead the army, but I wasn't sure I believed that. I had a feeling the decision was more spontaneous than the king was willing to admit, and I wasn't at all sure how my announcement would be met. Hello, I called out as I waved my arms to get everyone's attention. Sir Henry, Blueclaw murmured. He was dressed in his battle finery from head to toe, which included his bejeweled armor and a blue feather on his helmet. I have word from the king, I said. The men all looked at each other as I tried to gather the courage to announce that I had been selected to lead them into battle, but I was saved by Sebastian, who raced up with Casanova in hand. Sir Henry, he squeaked. You're direwolf. Thank you, I said, and I took the leather reins in my hand. Hank, Charles eventually said. We met with the king before your return. We know he wants you to lead the army. My trusted mentor was wearing a full set of armor, like the rest of the knights, though his suit bore the flag of stock, which was red and white, checkered with a large silhouette of a black pig in the middle. He looked fearsome in the armor, and on any other day of the year, he would have been able to destroy the vampire clan on his own. The plan has been changed, I said. The king and I agree that this is a trap. The vampires are trying to lure us into a battle during the eclipse. Mean ablation. They also know where our knights will be dispatched first and what roads the army will take once we leave the castle. I'm sure they'll have traps along the way that are meant to drain us before we even reach the battlefield. You're probably right, Blueclaw said and nodded. Vampires have always fought dirty. And it's nearly sunset, Greyback noted. That would normally be to our advantage, but if the moon goddess cannot help us tonight, then we'd be committing suicide, I murmured. But the king summoned us, a younger knight protested. And we will fight, I replied. But we will do so when we're ready to fight, not when the vampires want to fight. Hear, hear, Blueclaw cheered. We need to take control of this, I added. The vampires have been planning this for centuries, but that doesn't mean we have to let them run the show. There were murmurs from the gathered knights, and some of the younger knights looked angry at the decision, but the older knights who had survived hard-fought battles before nodded in agreement. Then we will ride at dawn, Blueclaw decided. It's the only safe way. If we go in the dark without the power of the moon goddess, we will lose this war before we ever set foot on the battlefield. Then what do we do now? I asked as I looked between the knights. Do we? I Don't know, stay here and sharpen our blades. Those who live close by should go home and tell their wives what we are about to do, Greyback laughed. A blue-blood wife will never forgive you if you don't. I thought of Tabitha, Sybil, and of course Imelda. Seemed only right that I would tell the girls about the danger of my next mission even though they wouldn't come with me. It felt strange not to have the three of them by my side for such a dangerous assignment, but I knew this was more than just another quest. Very well, Charles said. We meet here again at dawn, and then we ride into battle. Greyback and Blueclaw nodded in approval, and then the group of knights started to slowly disperse. I mounted Casanova and prepared to ride home. Without the moon I could only see a few feet in front of me even with my wolf senses, and I knew it was going to be a long ride home. But there was no way I would stay at the castle that night. I had to tell the girls what was happening, especially since I wasn't even sure I would return. This was the most dangerous mission I'd ever been on, and I intended to spend as much time with my girls as I could. I believe in you, Hank, Charles murmured as he and Bertie started to trot alongside me. And I believe in you, Charles, I replied. It might be the hardest thing any of us ever does, but I know we can save Lupercalia. Until tomorrow, he said and waved goodbye before he nudged Bertie toward home. I know it's dark, boy, I whispered to Casanova, but do you feel like running? Casanova yipped once and then pawed at the ground. He tugged at the reins so hard that he almost jerked them out of my hands. Then let's get home, I laughed and nudged him into the darkness. We have a mission to plan. Chapter 11. I could see the gate to the estate in the distance. For whatever reason it had been left open, even if the girls and the servants had no idea that I was actually going to end up returning that very night. Seemed like everyone in Lupercalia was aware of what was happening in some way, and it didn't surprise me that just when I needed to get back, the gate was open and ready to welcome me home. I closed the gate behind us, remounted, and then Casanova slowed down to a fast trot as we made our way through the torchlit fields that formed the entry to my manor house. It was hard to see much of the damage in the dark, but the scent of coffee beans was still strong at least, and there were several sacks of beans near the end of each row. As I neared the estate house, I saw that there were still lights in the windows of both my own large house and the houses of the servants and the field workers. I could hear voices near one of the fields, and while it didn't sound like a party, at least no one sounded terrified either. I heard someone call for another pan, and I realized there were still people trying to salvage the crop. Good boy, I said as I brought Casanova to a halt in front of the house. No one came to collect the direwolf since Jacob was probably asleep, and there didn't seem to be any point in taking him back to his barn since he would be needed again in a few short hours. All right, Casanova, I said. I'm going inside. You can roam around a little, but when I need you again, I'll whistle. I made a low whistle, and he nodded his head to signal that he understood. Didn't know quite where his capacity for language started and ended, but we seemed to have a pretty good system going when it came to communication. I walked up the steps and closed my eyes before I opened the door. For all I knew, this could be the last mission that I went on, and therefore the last time I would ever step foot in my estate. It was going to take the fight of a lifetime to defeat the vampires and their evil scheme, and I knew that for a fact. But no matter what, I was going to fight as hard as I could for as long as I could. If I was going to die, then I would die defending the land that had given me so much. When I felt more zen, I turned the doorknob and stepped into the empty house. The foyer was only lit by a few lanterns, and it seemed like all the cooks and the maids had gone to sleep. For a moment I thought that the girls must be in bed as well, but then I heard a door slam and looked up to find Tabitha on the landing wearing a long, white cotton nightdress that accentuated her gorgeous breasts and hips. Hank, she said as Imelda and Sybil followed behind her. Imelda was clad in a similar long nightdress, and Sybil was wearing a pink t-shirt that she must have squirreled away in her basket during one of our trips to New Jersey. Each woman looked beautiful in her own way, and I smiled at the girls who had changed my life forever. What are you doing back already? Imelda said, and her voice quivered slightly. The girls had clearly figured out that something worse than we'd imagined was about to happen, and though they tried to remain tough, there was fear and worry in their eyes. Let me get out of my armor and explain, I said. I don't have much time, but I want to change back into my human form before I have to go again. The girls exchanged a nervous look, and Sybil squeezed Tabitha's hand. As I started to remove my armor, they rushed down the stairs and came toward me. I set my armor aside and shook my head to shrink into my human form. I was going into battle as a hybrid, and I genuinely didn't know if I would ever be able to be just an ordinary human again, so I wanted to spend some time as the person I'd always been. Once the armor was off, I looked down and flexed my hand. My wrist still itched a little bit, even though the doctor's ointment had worked wonders on. But what would I do if I sustained something more severe? Hank, Sybil gasped and then grabbed my wrist. What happened to you? These vampires have something truly horrible in mind, I sighed. And they may have already achieved their goal once before. What do you mean? Tabitha asked. Not here, I said and glanced toward the hall that led to the kitchen. By the fire then, Tabitha said. If this is the last time I'm going to see you in the flesh, I want to be comfortable. Oh, Tabitha, don't say that, Sybil hissed. No, she's right, I said. That's why I wanted to be in my human form for these next few hours. The four of us walked into the living room, where there were still some embers in the fireplace. The room was bathed in a pale orange light, and it felt more like home than any of the other places I'd ever lived. This was my estate that I'd earned through all my hard work as a knight, and I felt my heart swell as I looked around at the trophies and knickknacks we'd collected. All right, Sybil said and patted the couch. There's room for all of us here. I sat down between the girls, and the threesome snuggled up against me. Wrapped my arms around them and felt the sweet warmth of their bodies against mine. I knew that I didn't have much time, but moments like this made it clear why I was going out to fight in the first place. Fill us in on everything, Tabitha said. Even the things that are supposed to be secret. They're always the most important things. Oh, Tabitha, Sybil sighed as a smile crept across my face. Well, the ablation is coming, as you probably guessed, I said. That's hardly a secret now, Tabitha pointed out. Let's talk about the summons. Did the king want you to find a way to predict when the ablation will occur? Or did he send you out to kill a few vampires and send a message that the kingdom of Lupercalia won't be intimidated? Tabitha, Sybil said and rolled her eyes. More like the second option, I suppose, I chuckled. As you can see, I wasn't sent with the vanguard troops to defend the holy sites. Instead, the king sent me to investigate a strange occurrence involving two of the young questing knights. A strange occurrence? Tabitha asked, and she sat up straighter and swept some of her platinum blonde hair out of her face. What in the goddess' name is that supposed to mean? That could be practically anything. Give him a chance to explain, Imelda said and placed a gentle hand on the noblewoman's arm. We're all anxious, Sybil added, but we shouldn't take it out on each other. Sorry, Tabitha said. It's these hormones. Yes, the hormones, Sybil said and rolled her eyes. Please, Hank, Imelda said quickly. Continue with your story. Two questing knights ventured into the forest of Thoth to try and take down a coven of vampires that had settled in an old smokehouse, I said. The king selected this particular quest because he thought the knights would be able to kill off the vampires quickly, and then return to the palace before we all left. And did they? Imelda murmured, and she curled into a little ball with her knees up to her shoulders. Not exactly, I said. A knight called Arthur was the only one who survived. They killed most of the vampires, but it was a bitter victory. Arthur carried his friend's body all the way back to the castle. That's horrible, Sybil said. I know there's always that chance when the knights ride away, but still. And so they sent you to finish the coven off? Tabitha asked. Yes, I said. I was sent to finish it off, but they also sent me to investigate something weird. Arthur said that they all had branded foreheads, and they kept talking about the master. Like the one in the letters, Sybil said. Uh-huh, I said. Like the one in the letters. When I got there, Casanova and I took down the two vampires who were still there, no problem. Well, not exactly no problem. As you can see from my wrist, I took a pretty nasty bite. And I had to get the doctor to attend to it because the goddess is so weak right now. Just like we feared, Sybil said. The other knights, Tabitha said. The ones who were sent out today to guard the holy sites. I don't know, I said. I wasn't told if they encountered any vampires yet. Back to the smokehouse, Sybil said. Right, I sighed. Once I finished off the vampires, I took a look around. It was definitely a vampire lair, but it was more than that. It looked more like a temple with shrines, candles, beads, banners, everything. And the symbol that was on everything looked like one of the heraldic marks of a werewolf clan. The vampires even had it branded on their foreheads. A coat of arms? Tabitha asked. But I've never heard of a vampire with a coat of arms. I didn't know they were organized in that way at all. Are you sure it wasn't a rune? It's impossible, Imelda confirmed. Even Wenderoth didn't have a symbol. Would have made everything too conspicuous. Vampires are secretive creatures, and they certainly don't cooperate enough to form a religion. Why, they'll often abandon their coven if they can find better food somewhere else. There's no such thing as a vampire coat of arms, Tabitha insisted. That's what I thought, I said. But I took one of the chains and showed the symbol to the king. He recognized it as the coat of arms of a knight who disappeared about 300 years ago. Someone from a house called Gregoriat. Tabitha sat straight up, and her hazel eyes widened in shock. Gregoriat, she said. I know of them. My grandfather used to tell stories of how he grew up during the time when their house went extinct. They were an extremely powerful noble family in Lupercalia, much like my own or even the Greybacks. But the last son disappeared on a quest, never to be heard of again. Disappeared? Sybil asked, and she cocked an eyebrow. What do you mean? Disappeared? Well, he died, obviously, Tabitha shrugged. I just want it to be a little less graphic. But he was killed, and the body was never recovered. Do they usually recover bodies? I asked. To be honest, no, she sighed and then shrugged. The only time more knights might be sent to recover a body is if the missing person is a decorated knight, or someone as important as the king. But questing knights, no matter what house they're from, are not usually afforded that kind of treatment. And it's kind of an unspoken fact that the vampires usually drink a fallen knight's blood if they're not successful. She's right, Imelda murmured, and her eyes glazed over as she obviously remembered something dark from her past. That's just the way of the land. Tabitha's right, I said. I just said that, the priestess offered in a questioning tone. No, I said and shook my head. I meant she's right that he just disappeared. You were all looking at the history of ablations earlier, weren't you? Yes, Sybil replied with a nod. The book we have only goes back about 100 years ago, but we found references to older events. And when was the last ablation? I asked. Around 300 years ago, Imelda said, and then she clapped her hands. Which is when the last Gregoriat heir went missing. I agreed. I'm pretty sure he didn't die that night. I think he was turned into a vampire. The room fell so quiet that I could hear each individual crackle of the fire. I waited for the girls to say something, but the trio seemed locked in place. I saw Sybil finally react first as the brunette sat up a little straighter and started to smooth her already flat hair. This is insane, the witch declared. I've never heard of anything like this. A werewolf vampire? It's just not possible. It goes against the laws of everything that Lupercalia is built upon, Tabitha said and shook her head. And I hate it. That disgusts me. To think that our two could mix is. Hey, Imelda protested and bared her teeth. Sorry, Imelda, Tabitha backtracked. But you know how much this upsets me. I'm a blue blood for the goddess' sake. I've been raised to abhor the vampires and all that they do. And for good reason, Imelda replied. All the vampires do is wreak havoc and cause destruction. But there are still things about vampire culture that Lupercalian nobles don't understand. I'm sure that's true, I said. And I'm also sure that's why the goddess brought you into our lives, so you could help us understand these things. Hank is right, Sybil said and looked at Tabitha. If we want to defeat the vampires, then we need to understand how they think. Yes, you're right, Tabitha sighed. I'm sorry, Imelda. No need to apologize, the priestess said and smiled. I understand your concerns. So, Hank, if you're right and this night was somehow turned during the last ablation, what does that mean for us? Tabitha asked. The vampires are going to do it again, I said. But it's not just one night. They'll try to turn. Every night that heads into battle will be a target. The girls shuddered slightly and the room turned silent for a moment. The last few embers died away, and the room was cast into a darkness that matched our mood. So that's what all the experiments were for, Sybil said. How long have they been working on this plan? I don't know, I replied. I'm not sure if they even knew it was possible when they turned Gregoriat or if that was just a happy coincidence. But ever since then, they've certainly been trying to understand how it happened and working to come up with a way to turn as many knights as they could. Once they understood how it happened, they just had to wait for the next oblation. It's unthinkable, Tabitha shook her head. After all these centuries to have everything collapse in a single night. It hasn't happened yet, I corrected her. And I'm damn well going to make sure they don't succeed. I believe in you, Hank, Sybil sighed. But with the goddess as weak as she currently is, there are no guarantees. Everyone who rides out could be killed. Or even worse, turned into a vampire. That's always a risk, I said. The odds may favor the vampires this time. But that doesn't mean we should give up and hide. You'll just have to be extra careful, Tabitha said. The important thing to understand is when you need to assume which form. At least that's what my father always used to say. And if anyone would know, it would be old Blue Claw, I said with a nod. But why wouldn't you stay in your hybrid form? Sybil asked with a frown. There are some things that a great wolf does better than a hybrid, the noblewoman replied. Their senses are even better than a hybrid's, and the instinct to hunt can guide them to their prey, even if they leave the field of battle. Makes sense, I nodded. I've never changed into the great wolf in the middle of a battle, but I can see how it might be helpful. Especially if you're part of a group, Tabitha said. My father's stories about the old battles usually involved a great wolf or two that would turn the tide. He and the other knights of his age would try to have at least one knight in great wolf form when they fought. I think we'll need more than one great wolf for this next battle, I said. And the other important thing is to always keep the goddess in your mind and in your heart, Imelda said. Remember, when you fight for her, you fight with her and as an extension of her. The goddess represents all of us, all of the families, all of the nobility, and all of the gorgeous forests and hills in Lupercalia. She's in your comrades, and she is the one who made you a knight in the first place. Of course, Tabitha said, when you keep your faith in your fellow fighters and in the goddess, you can't go wrong. Sybil squeezed my hand, and I looked up at the women and smiled. I was so inspired by how supportive they were of my role as a knight, even if it meant that I might not come back, either on the battlefield or in the home. We were all part of Lupercalia, and we all wanted to protect the land from anyone or anything that wanted to destroy it. Thanks so much, girls, I said with a smile. You know, you guys have really changed everything for me. I'm going to make you proud, I promise. Lupercalia is my home now, too, and I won't let anything destroy it. I placed my hand on Tabitha's round, pregnant belly, and the noblewoman looked up at me and smiled. I can't wait to tell this little one how proud we were of their father when you rode back from battle after killing off the vampires, she said. You're already the noble savior of Lupercalia. How much trouble is it to, save the kingdom one more time? Exactly. I laughed and then looked between the three girls. They really were everything to me. But as I considered the risks of going into battle, I knew that there was another woman in my life who I was going to have to do some serious explaining to in case I disappeared. Look, girls, I said very slowly, I think you know that this battle is going to be the most dangerous of my life. Yes, Sybil nodded. And there's a chance, a very small chance, that I won't survive, I said. The girls went silent, but they all looked down and nodded. It was a hard pill to swallow, but they knew the risks that came with being the wives and girlfriend of a knight. Indeed, Imelda sighed. So here's what I'm going to do, I said. I have to say something to Ava, and when I get back, I'm going to leave the moon ring with you three in case you need to leave without me. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I want you to be able to escape if we lose the war. Sybil's emerald eyes glowed at me as she gulped. Tears formed in the corners of her eyes, but she quickly swept them away and nodded. It won't come to that, Tabitha said quickly, but it's still a good idea. Good, I said. I'll head back to New Jersey now and tell Ava, and then I'll leave the ring on my wooden chest in the bedroom before I leave tomorrow. The girls nodded, and suddenly all of them were piled onto my lap. You'll be amazing out there, Hank, Sybil said. We believe in you. And so does the goddess, Imelda added, and as she pulled away, the blonde priestess looked like she had a light bulb moment. I have an idea, she said, and she turned to the others. Hank, I know you don't have much time. But what about if I perform a brief blessing? Just to make sure. Of course, I smiled. Even though the moon goddess was weaker, the idea of a blessing put me at ease. After all, I'd seen what Imelda's blessings could do. Are we doing this right now? Tabitha asked. Of course, Imelda replied as she stood up and moved to the fireplace. Everybody form a circle and join hands. Fine, Tabitha grumbled but stood up. I took Imelda's hand in my right and Sybil's in my left. Then when the priestess nodded at me, I closed my eyes and tried to focus on what she was going to say. By the powers of the goddess, the priestess said, no matter how weak or strong you may be, grant Sir Henry the utmost faith in your divinity. May he be filled with the strength of not only the goddess, but also all of those who love him, his companions, his lovers, and his family. May all of these people come through him to help in the fight against evil. Suddenly my hand started to burn with a white light. It wasn't like a hot burning, but more like a cool and fresh radiance that came out of the place where our hands touched. For a second, my entire body felt like it was being lifted slightly above the ground. I remembered the faces of my parents, of my sister, and of the girls, and I thought about Greyback and Charles. As I did so, I felt a pure warm energy course through my veins. Almost as soon as it had started, the sensation started to fade. But I felt refreshed and renewed, and when I looked up at the girls, I knew they felt it as well. That was beautiful, Imelda, Sybil said with a smile. It's one of my favorite blessings, Imelda giggled. It always seemed to revive everyone. I glanced out the window and saw it was still pitch black, but I knew that it wouldn't remain that way for long. If I was going to be back at the castle by sunrise, I would need to leave soon. All right, ladies, I said as I smiled at the girls. It's time I went to visit my sister. Even though I was about to leave, the blessing had obviously put everyone in a good mood. The vibe was more lighthearted than before, and I could tell that our little group felt more at ease. When you see my dad tomorrow, be sure to tell him I love him too. Tabitha laughed. I know he'll be revving to get out there and slice off some vampire faces, but he'll still appreciate the sentiment. Tabitha, Sybil hissed. I laughed and shook my head, but it suddenly felt like the right time to leave. It was exactly how I envisioned the girls in my mind whenever we were apart, with Tabitha saying something egregious, Sybil scolding her, and Imelda glowing with giggles. I'll be back soon, I said and turned the pinky ring I wore. The room disappeared before me like a backdrop falling to the floor, and a cold wind replaced the warm feeling of the hearth. I felt like I was plummeting through space as the universe bent and twisted around me, though I had done this journey so many times that I knew to just let it flow over me. Time always seemed to contort in the vortex as well, but this trip seemed to pass more quickly than most. Solid ground pushed back against my feet before I could blink, and when I looked around, I was in the green kitchen of my house in New Jersey. The entire place smelled delicious, like pine and cinnamon, and the cleaning crew had clearly been in because everything was tidy and organized. There were a few dim lights on timer, so I wasn't in complete darkness, but the sky outside was as black as the one I'd just left in Lupercalia. My sister was not a fan of late-night calls, but this was one I had to make, and I would keep dialing until she picked up. I picked up the landline and punched in the number that I had dialed so many times in the past to complain about elaborate coffee orders or middle schoolers spilling hot chocolate on book stock. Ava had always listened patiently, and then told me to suck it up and report for work at our bookstore the next day. I wondered what kind of advice she'd offer for the upcoming battle. Hi, you've reached Ava. Please leave a message after the tone, the automated voice announced. I rolled my eyes and hung up before calling again, but the voicemail picked up again. I glanced at the clock, though I didn't need to see just how early in the morning it was to know that my sister was probably asleep, and if she had heard the phone ring, she was determined to ignore it. The only solution was to keep calling until she answered. After about 5 times, the phone stopped ringing before the voicemail picked up, and I heard some shuffling on the other end of the line. Hank, Ava's very tired voice muttered. Were you arrested or something? Is that why you keep calling? No, wait. They only let you call once. Ava, I interrupted before she could get rolling. What the fuck is going on? She asked. I was asleep, like any sane person at this hour of the night. Ava, I need you to come over, I said. Right now. Can't it wait until morning? She groaned. I mean later this morning. Like, when people are up and having their breakfast and taking the dog for a walk. Nope, I sighed. It has to be now, Ava. Well, will you at least tell me why? She demanded. I can't, I said. The company is in trouble. The company? She asked. What the fuck does that mean? The last time I checked the books, everything was just fine. I can't explain over the phone, I said. I need to discuss this in person. Oh God, she huffed. Did you sell shares to the mafia or something? Did you whack someone? Or did you hire them to tell the competition to fuck off and now they want payment? Ava, calm down, I chuckled. The mafia isn't involved and I didn't whack anyone. Look, can you just come here? Why can't you come here? She demanded. You're the one who wants to have this meeting at some ungodly hour. Trust me, it's better if we meet here, I said. And you know I wouldn't do this if it wasn't important. Ava muttered a few curse words that my mother would not have approved of, and it sounded like she was moving around her home as she tried to find something to wear. Fine, she finally snapped. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The phone call ended, so I set the receiver back on the charger and looked around the kitchen again. I hated that I'd had to scare her, but it wasn't an exaggeration to say the company was at risk. If I failed to stop the vampires, then the moonbeans that had built our coffee empire would never be the same, and our company would either get swallowed up by someone like Joetown Coffee, or it would go under. Either way, the life we'd been living would come to an end, and Ava would be back where she started. I paced into the dining room and then the main foyer as I waited for her to arrive. As I walked back and forth, I glanced toward the wall of glass that overlooked the pool, and I paused for a moment to stare at the simple luxury that I would never have believed could be mine. The company had afforded me this serene house in the nicest area of my hometown, and I'd be damned if those stupid vampires were going to take that away from me. I never thought when I was growing up here that I'd live this kind of life, the one that all the rich kids in my school had. It wasn't just my life in Lupercalia I was fighting for, but everything I had built here in New Jersey too. A little bell went off, which signaled that someone had used the private gate. Ava was one of the few who had the code, and the familiar sound of her SUV soon confirmed her arrival. She parked near the front door and then her footsteps rang against the marble as she marched up the steps, and a moment later the doorbell rang through the house. I took a deep breath and then forced myself to walk calmly to the front door. I started to reach for the knob, but Ava was impatient and pounded on the door with her fist. You've got to give me time to reach the door, I said as I swung the door open. Ava just glared at me, and her arms were crossed, which was a sure sign that she was angry. She was still in her red and blue plaid pajamas, though she'd pulled on a pair of Uggs and tied her hair into an extremely messy bun. She also had some under-eye gel masks plastered to her skin, which were magnified by the glasses she wore. I noticed that she was carrying a Moon Bean Brewer's branded dark blue flask, with silver sparkly stars and the big moon logo in the middle. The smell of it tickled my nose, and I remembered for a second what the real Moon Bean brew was supposed to smell like when the goddess was still in power. I know you were just standing by the door, she snapped. It shouldn't take you that long to answer the door. I was just trying to stay calm, I said. And good morning, Ava. You don't get to practice calm at this ungodly hour, she replied. And, hello, Hank. Want to tell me why you dragged me over here? She took a few steps inside and plopped her crazy keychain with her car keys, house keys, store keys, a pocket mirror, and pop-out hairbrush on the table next to the entryway. She then reached up to rub one eye, and then remembered she still had the mask on. Ava, I said as I tried to reset the conversation, thank you so much for coming at this hour. I know that it's kind of late. Hank, what the fuck is going on? She said and rolled her eyes. Are the girls here? Phew. Okay, Hank. Take a deep breath, because now it was time for the truth to come out. No, I said. Actually, this time it's just me. Just you. She raised an eyebrow and started to tap with her foot. I caught a glimpse of her extremely blue eyes, which were pretty much exactly mine. In fact, now that we were spending more time apart than we had in our whole lives, I was starting to realize just how similar we looked. Except for the whole shifter thing, of course. Yeah, I said. It's just you and me tonight, kid. So, are they in the Pine Barrens? She asked. You know, getting beans or Whatever. I took a deep breath and decided to let it all out. They're not from the Pine Barrens, Ava, I admitted. They're from. I knew that Tabitha was British, Ava laughed. She has that funny accent. It's kind of different to Sybil and Imelda's, like she was raised by royalty. Or something. She was, I said. Practically, at least. Ava, there's something that I've been meaning to tell you, and it's going to be a lot to handle. In fact, you're not going to believe me at first because it's completely bonkers. Ava blinked a few times and nodded. Okay, she said. Well, how about you tell me what it is and then I'll let you know if I think you're shitting me and that it's bonkers. Fine, I nodded. Okay, where do I begin? You know when I ran into that house that was on fire? Last summer, she nodded. Of course I remember it. You almost got yourself killed, you bird brain. I did, yes, I said. But, basically, I had a visitation from a goddess. The moon goddess. And she gave me this magical ring made of moon silver. See? I held up the ring, but Ava rolled her eyes. Hank, we all read the article where you did this whole shtick, she said. I don't get why you're making this joke now. Did you actually bring me over here to try and convince me of your whole brand selling point? No, I shook my head. Here's the thing, Ava. It's not a lie. Sybil, Tabitha, and Imelda are from a magical land called Lupercalia, where the werewolves are the nobility and are the knights for the king. Hank, what? She asked. So you mean the Pine Barrens? Ava, I've never been to the Pine Barrens, I said. Except for like one time. In 7th grade on a class trip. The moonbeans are from Lupercalia, they're not from this world. The moon goddess reigns over the land, and she imbues the soil with magic. That's why they taste the way they do. So they're magic beans from a magic world, Ava said. Okay, let me just take a minute to wrap my head around this. So, not to get graphic, but you know, it's pretty obvious that you're with all 3 of those girls, am I right? I didn't know where she was going with this, but I guess there was only one way of knowing. Yeah, I said. Yeah, we are. Okay, she nodded. And you're saying they're actually from a magical land, full of werewolves, kings, and magic beans? Yes, I answered. And the goddess is weak because she's under attack from the vampires. And when she's weak, her magic doesn't work, and the beans don't have their power. So instead of tasting incredible, they just taste like normal coffee. Gotcha. She nodded, and she looked like all the blood was draining from her face. Hank, listen to me. Are you in a cult? Have these women indoctrinated you into something fucking weird? Because listen to me, I don't care how small I am. I will protect you no matter what, and we can drive down to the Pine Barrens and bust their asses if you need. You know my pal Jessica Parlavecchio's dad is connected. They live over in Union, so we could just. Ava, I'm not in a cult. I rolled my eyes. Also, Jessie Parlavecchio are. You kidding me? She was my first kiss. Oh my God, what? She gasped and her face turned red. She's literally 18 months older than you. That's disgusting. We're getting off track, Ava, I said. And I really need you to understand what I'm saying about the beans. Yes, she said. And I'm worried. Do you need me to call an ambulance? Because I will. We can get you to a really great facility. We can ship you out to some fancy place in LA if we need to. I don't need to be shipped out, I said. Look, now don't freak out, but I can prove it's true. Ava sighed and glanced toward the door like she was wondering if she could still get a decent night's sleep. But she finally looked back at me and then nodded reluctantly. Fine, Hank, she said. Where's this proof? I'd only transformed a couple of times in New Jersey, and I knew it was harder here than it was in Lupercalia. So I closed my eyes to block out the world and focused on what it felt like when I was a werewolf. I felt my body start to shift and change, and though it seemed to take longer than usual, I could feel the dark hair that covered my skin as it shifted in the air from the AC, and I knew I was taller before I even opened my eyes. And then there was the fact that Ava wouldn't stop screaming. What the fuck? She shouted when she could actually form words. Holy motherfucker. She dropped down to her knees and made a cruciform on her body before starting to recite Hail Marys for some reason. I looked down and shrugged as I scratched behind my wolfish ears. Ava, I said in my deeper, growlier voice. Ava, what are you doing? Oh, what am I doing? She asked, and she started to laugh. What am I doing? He asked. What the fuck are you doing? You just turned into a fucking beast. Before my eyes. Yep, I said. You didn't believe me, so I had to show you myself. But what's up with all the Catholic business? I don't know, she said and shook her head. I just remember during thunderstorms when Mom used to recite Hail Marys because that's what her mom did and her mom before her and all the way back to Sicily, yada yada yada. Anyway, look at me, I'm talking to a werewolf. What the fuck is going on? I don't have time to explain it all again, Ava, I told my shock sister. I'm supposed to get back to the castle before sunrise so that we can ride into battle. Time is of the essence. She looked up at me and gulped. You're telling the truth, aren't you? She whispered. Holy shit, all those crazy stories you were telling the reporters, they were all true. Yep, I said. Not one word of it is a lie. It never was. And the coffee? She asked. Is really from Lupercalia, I said. And this is where it gets tricky. Lupercalia is under attack, and if we don't defeat the vampires, then the beans will be gone for good. That means no more big houses, no more millions, no more any of it. She shook her head like she couldn't believe it, but then her attention was caught by the pool. Look at what you've made, she murmured. Mom and Dad would be real proud of this, you know. It's more than I ever thought we could do. I know, I said, which is why I want to protect it. So why are you telling me this now? She asked, and she winced slightly. You weren't so worried about your other adventures, obviously. They were dangerous, just not as dangerous, I guess, I sighed. But the power in the kingdom flows through the moon goddess, and she's been weakened. The vampires are going to attack while she's weak, so the king has summoned all the knights for one big battle, and that includes me. So are you considered a good fighter? She asked. Because I've never seen you fight anyone except for that time that Jeremy Roth put you in a garbage can in freshman year. I threw my head back and laughed. If only they knew that now I was lauded as the noble savior of Lupercalia, and that I wasn't about to get shoved in any more garbage cans for the rest of my life. I'm a really good fighter, Ava, I assured her. Really good. But the thing is, this is going to be a major battle. Epic battle big. So the reason I'm telling you now is because, well, she knew what I was going to say and she took a deep breath. There's a chance. She started to stay and then scrubbed at her cheek. There's a chance that I might not come back, I confessed. And if I die, I obviously want you to run the coffee business. Obviously, she sighed. Look, I don't know what vampires are like in this other place, but I'm sure you'll kick their ass. What do? Drive a stake through their heart or something? Something like that, I sighed. Ava put her face in her hands. She was a steely, no-nonsense woman like my mom, but I knew that she was also heavily sentimental and that she would do anything for family. I took a step toward her when I heard her whimper, but I stopped when she held up a hand. Don't, she said, and she lifted her head and smiled. She'd obviously been crying, but I knew that she wanted to keep a brave face. Here, I said, and I shook my head back and forth and shrunk down to my normal human form. Ava looked relieved that I was no longer a werewolf, and she fell into my arms and gave me a big hug. If I don't come back, the girls will be able to find a way to get the moon beans over to you, I said. I can't make any promises about how good they'll be, but oh, fuck the beans, she laughed, and she gave me a giant squeeze before pulling back and looking at me. I can't believe this. My brother going into battle. I'm so proud of you, Hank, and everything you've achieved, even if it is a pretty fucking unorthodox way of doing it. Thanks, I laughed. And I want you to remember something, she said, and she lifted her eyebrow and crossed her arms. Even though you're a giant, terrifying, hulking wolf, you're always going to be my stinky little brother, okay? And nobody can mess with that. Tell those vampires that I'll personally find a way to Lupercalia if they hurt my little brother, and I'll transform into the biggest, scariest bitch they've ever seen in their life. I'll tell them that, I replied as I felt my eyes mist up. Ava had known me my whole life, and I couldn't think of anyone I trusted more than her. But dark things were afoot, and I had to head back to Lupercalia. I love you, sis, I said as I pulled her in for one more hug. I love you too, little bro, she said. And I know you'll come back. Okay. That's an order. Ah, I said as I stepped back. Well, when you put it like that, I guess I don't have any choice but to survive. Exactly, she said before furrowing her brow. Wait, how are you going to get back? The ring, I said, and I held up my hand and wiggled my pinky finger. But it's a piece of jewelry, she said. Does it make you fly or something? You'll just have to see, I said, and I gave her one last smile before twisting the ring. I'd never seen what it looked like to travel via the ring from the outside before, but Ava's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth just as the world that I'd been born in disappeared before me. Once again I found myself plummeting through time and space with nobody to catch me. I didn't know where I was or how the magic even worked, but all I knew was that I could rely on it. When my feet felt like they were on solid ground, I blinked a few times and found that I was back in the living room. The fire had died out and I could begin to hear the very first birds of the morning start to tweet in the distance. I padded softly through the dimly lit house, up the stairs and straight to my bedroom. When I eased the door open, I found all three girls asleep in my bed. I watched their chests rise and fall in a gentle rhythmic movement for a moment before I crept inside. I walked over to the chest and after another quick glance at the girls, I eased the ring from my finger and placed it in the promised spot. Came off surprisingly easily, and I felt a twinge of regret as I set it on the wood. I'll see you soon, I whispered to the girls. Sybil stirred for a moment like she might have heard me, but then she fell back to sleep. The pile of beautiful women readjusted, and then the only sound was Tabitha's soft snores. I made my way down the stairs and shook my head back and forth to change into my hybrid form. Then I leaped down the last few steps as a 9-foot wolf and pulled on my armor in the main foyer. I made sure that I had my sword, my sack, and that everything was in its proper place before offering a salute to the estate that I'd earned through all my hard work. The morning air was cool against my fur, and a few streaks of gray light peered low in the sky, but at least we would have some daylight for now, though there was no telling how soon the storms would return. I whistled for Casanova in a tone that most humans wouldn't notice, and a moment later I heard something running across a nearby field. I grinned as the big black direwolf appeared at the edge of a row of moonbeams, and I could have sworn the pup grinned back. All right, Casanova, I nodded at him. It's time to go.